Good morning, everyone. If John Chambers said that Portugal has talent, I think a lot of that talent is here today. In fact, I know they are. And not only are they in this room, we have also more than 500 simulcast participants that are watching us online, and they're participating via Twitter. So I want to welcome them also and include them in today's activities. To fulfill the Secretaries of State's challenge to us to find the solutions, we have here today, we're going to talk about many tools. We're going to talk about financing startups, turning research into business, we're going to showcase some of the best and less known examples of Portuguese entrepreneurship. And today, we're celebrating the end of the Global Entrepreneurship Week here in Portugal. The Global Entrepreneurship Week in Portugal, well, all over the world, is a Kaufman Foundation initiative. And its objective is to connect people, to help them explore together, learn together. That's what we're going to be doing here today, exploring new ideas, new paths, how to walk them, and learning from the source, from our speakers that are going to share their experience with us here today. So a very warm welcome to our speakers also. Thank you very much for being here. And our first speaker is from the Kaufman Foundation. Paul Kedrosky, a Kaufman Senior Fellow, a venture capitalist and entrepreneur. And before he starts his speech, a short video about the Global Entrepreneurship Week. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the day.
Sandbox is all about bringing together the most inspiring young innovators below 30. We identify and select those movers and shakers below.
So there's no video apparently. So you got me instead. I'm Paul Kedrosky, and thanks very much for having me here. I'm with the Kaufman Foundation. I'm a senior fellow there. So I'll try and keep this fairly speedy and see what I can do to help us stay on schedule as we move along here. Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, we're good. We're live. So what I thought I could open up with real quick are sort of, so 4 quick things about me, give you a little bit of context and maybe personalize a bit. So I'm a senior fellow at the Kaufman Foundation. The Kaufman Foundation is in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm not. I'm in San Diego, California, for reasons that will probably make sense if you've ever spent time in either place. The Kaufman Foundation is the largest private foundation in the world devoted to entrepreneurship and economic growth. We have about $2 billion billion with a B, under management that we use to fund all of the many things we do across the United States and increasingly outside the United States as well in terms of driving entrepreneurship and economic growth. Over the last probably decade, or maybe longer than that now, I guess about 15 years, I've probably funded about 55 companies or participated in syndicates to fund 50 or 55 companies. So I've got some kind of bug that I keep doing this stuff. Sold companies to Twitter, Cisco, Microsoft, lots of other folks. And started a number of companies of my own, I guess 5 now, sold 1, shut down 4, so that's not bad. So there's a couple of quick things about me to give you a little bit of context. So let me march into this. So you've heard a little bit about Global Entrepreneurship Week, so I won't spend too much time on it other than to say that Kaufman's really pleased to be part of it, going on around the world. John Ortmans, who you see his lovely picture in the bottom right corner, is a fine man who's driving most of these efforts around the world. All kinds of great things going on. Some of the highlights, which you may or may not be aware of, there's a Startup Open going on this week, sort of a Meet the Dragons, Meet the VCs kind of thing. In 20 US cities and a host of cities around the world, there's a Startup Weekend events happening. All kinds of good stuff. all throughout the week, and it's just been a wonderful thing watching this event expand around the world over the last 5 years since it was originally launched. All those red countries are countries that have something going on, with the exception of the ones in gray that you see, have something going on here during Global Entrepreneurship Week, so it's just great stuff. As I think was already mentioned, we've got about 100 official countries, maybe a little more, 120 I heard recently, about 20 million participants. So this has just turned into a great global event. So I want to start off by talking about a question we get from our board all the time, which I think is a really bizarre question, but which stumps us regularly at the Kaufman Foundation until we finally figured out what the answer was. And the question was, so if you're advocating for entrepreneurship, I mean, who's the opposition? It's a good question. I mean, who is the opposition? I mean, it's sort of, we're out there, we're wandering around, we're talking about entrepreneurship, we're meeting with entrepreneurs, and it seems like one of those things like advocating for oxygen or advocating for the color red or something. I mean, doesn't it seem like something, I mean, it's true. If you're advocating for entrepreneurship, who is exactly you're arguing against? And we realize that, that may be an argument you can make in the United States where sort of entrepreneurship has taken hold in a major way. It's less true outside the United States. But even within the US, it's not about sort of advocating either for or against. There really is an against party that says, enough of this entrepreneurship thing, it's turning out to be an irritation. It's more that we want more of it, right? We want more entrepreneurship to going on because we've realized that it's this incredible force that drives economic growth and creates jobs and all those lovely things. So it's not so much that there's someone advocating for and advocating against. It's always this question of how can we get more of this incredibly powerful economic force. Did I just lose? What just happened here? Apparently I have to move faster or the screen shuts off. So this is the way we kind of think about things, or the way we kind of think about this era that we're living in right now and why entrepreneurship is more important than ever. This is from a fantastic book by Carlotta Perez, Technical Bubbles, which I'd encourage you to read. It's just fantastic. And it sort of tries to put in context all the different phases that society has gone through over the last hundreds of years, really, to the present day. And if you look at sort of this phase 5, and I won't spend too much time on it other than to say that what has happened over the last 15 or 20 years is we've built out all kinds of important infrastructure. Think about the emergence of tools and technologies like YouTube and Twitter and all kinds of other things like that. Those things have been built on top of sort of the bones of abandoned technologies from the late 1990s, right? I mean, we couldn't have done a YouTube, we couldn't have done a Twitter, we couldn't have done even a Facebook, or even the dearly departed almost MySpace, were it not for the sorts of things that got built during the late 90s, this incredible build out of fiber optic lines, this incredible capacity that we created in backbone networks to do all kinds of interesting things. Sure. Is that better? You don't like feedback? What's wrong with you people? It's great. So this incredible build out of all of these things led to all this excess capacity, which led to this period we're in now, which is this sort of fifth phase where we built out the dot-com and internet mania. We had this incredible wrenching recession that's was cataclysmic in many places and continues to be huge problems around the world, but is leading to this next phase, right? We're building on top of the bones of all the things that we had before, and there's the opportunity for entrepreneurs. And I say this all the time, and usually younger people love it and government people hate it, but the best entrepreneurs are kind of economic vandals. They go out and they like to bust stuff. Right? I mean, they're not so interested in building on what came before because they're saying, this whole thing, all of this stuff, it just sucks, it's bad. I want to get rid of it, I want to change it, I want to do things differently, and I know what has to happen, and I'm impatient. The best entrepreneurs that I know are people who are really sort of scratching their own itch, right? They're people who, here I go again, by the way. Maybe my whole body's mic'd. I've had that happen. The best entrepreneurs are people who want to scratch their own itch, right? I mean, they're people who say, I don't want to wait around, I just want to do it, I just want to get it done. And I've waited and waited and waited for someone to create this really cool thing, and nobody has. And since they haven't, I will, right? So it's this idea of being people scratching their own itch and economic vandals. So the first piece of advice I always give to anyone who's thinking of being an entrepreneur is don't. And the great thing about that piece of advice is most people take it. And they don't become entrepreneurs. Just out of curiosity, just a quick show of hands in terms of the number of people here who've actually created a company. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So we've got what, about 25%, maybe 30%? And of the folks who, a show of hands of people who, haven't but are contemplating doing so, and not just showing off. You have to actually be seriously thinking about it. So it's people who are seriously thinking about it. You haven't created a company, but you're seriously thinking about creating something. So we've got a pretty good show of hands of the folks remaining. Look, everybody else, you have to leave. I'm really sorry. That's it for you. So generally speaking, that's my first words of advice for obvious reasons, right? It's incredibly hard. There's this penchant especially in the Silicon Valley sort of media to sort of make it sound incredibly glamorous and exciting and all those things. Creating a company isn't glamorous and exciting. It's really freaking hard. I mean, it's really hard. And most of them fail, so it's incredibly disappointing at the end. But for the people who can't imagine doing anything else because they're frustrated and maddened and they want to break stuff and they want to scratch their own itch, there is no alternative, right? That's the great thing about the best entrepreneurs, is there is no real alternative. They have to do this because the world won't live up to their expectations and won't do what they want. So that's it down at the level of entrepreneurs. Let's take it up a level and talk about why it's important at a societal level. Well, it's incredibly important because these are just some quick stats. So just looking at, for example, the revenues from venture capital-backed companies in the United States, all the way up to about $3 trillion in 2010. Huge percentage of GDP, about sitting up at around 21% of total U.S. GDP in the 28 to 2010 period. I mean, this is a gigantic economic force. The fastest growing companies hugely outpacing US overall sales growth. We go on and on and on about this graph at Kaufman, but the whole point of it is to show that all net job creation now in the United States is from companies less than, on a rolling basis, less than 5 years old. So think about that. So all those long-standing companies that we all know so well, irrelevant from the standpoint of net job growth. Irrelevant from the standpoint of net job growth. So if we're talking about job creation, what are we talking about? We're talking about young companies. If we're talking about young companies, what are we talking about? We're talking about entrepreneurs, right? It's as easy and straightforward as that. Now, it's worth reminding yourself that in some level, this is the drunkard's walk. Anyone ever seen this before? It's the idea that a drunk walking out of a bar, he's only got sort of two directions he can go, and one of them's closed. That's the door of the bar, so you can't keep banging into the door and going backwards. You eventually, with a probability 100%, where will you find yourself given enough time? In the gutter on the road, right? Because you just sort of like, you go bang, 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 and a little bit this way and a little bit this way, but given enough time, all drunks will eventually fall in the gutter. So small companies are a little bit like that, right? Because when they're founded, do they have the option to lay off employees? No. Well, I mean, I guess they could, but it wouldn't really work mathematically speaking. So you have negative employees. That would be really interesting, but I don't quite see how it would work. So the magic thing about young companies is they have only one thing they can do, two things, I suppose, grow or die, right? They can only grow or die. Older companies that have been around a long time, have lots of options. They can lose companies, they can add or lose employees and add employees, but the magic thing about young companies is this is what they can do. They can only do this, and that's why they're so important economically speaking. So there's these incredible forces, and I don't have to tell you here in Portugal and in Europe, the disruptive forces working through our economy right now because they're happening here on a macro level, but let's take it down to the level of individuals. Here's some recent research we're doing at Kaufman. This looked at the flow of people in and out of a region. Now this used to be this little place called Detroit, right? It used to be one of the most entrepreneurial cities in America. This used to be one of the most entrepreneurial cities. Why? Because of the emergence of this cluster, this incredibly important economic engine called the auto industry. So what we tried to do was over the last 5 years, look at inbound and outbound migration. Look at the flow of people, because people respond to incentives. That's basic economics. They do what's in their own best interest, right? They're not going to hang around if this whole Detroit thing's not working out, they're unemployed, and all the houses are being abandoned around them. If they can leave, they will leave. Or if things are fantastic, more of them will come. And so what you see here is this incredible skew of outbound migration, the red lines, right? Those are those fat red lines heading out, versus inbound migration. We have a city that's hollowing out as people say, you know what, this sort of the opportunities here for me, entrepreneurial or otherwise, are largely disappearing, and so people are moving. You can take it at a deeper level, and I went on the time to do it, but think about where they're going. They're going to sort of unusual places, as you will see in the next slide. So think about these sort of pockmarks all over the country. So here's a contrary example. Look at it. Look at Silicon Valley. This is San Francisco and the Bay Area, and the flow of people into and out of the Bay Area. So what you're seeing is I think, incredibly interesting. It's dominated by people coming in, which isn't too surprising, but there's still an incredible number of people leaving, right? And this is something that's fundamental to the way we at Kaufman think about entrepreneurship. It's not about trying to get everybody who lives here today to stay. It's not about convincing everyone who's anywhere else to come here. It's about building up this flux, right? This idea of people passing in and out, because as they pass in and out of your region, They bring their talents and their skills and their capital and their ideas and their innovative approaches, and it gets exchanged almost in a viral sort of way when they're there. You meet other people. They have a bright idea. You say, you know what, maybe we should do something. You want to create a company. You decide to do it. You decide not to do it. But it's this constant exchange of collisions and people and talent and dynamism. And what you're seeing in the cities that are the most entrepreneurial is this incredible flux and flow, right, of people flowing into and out of the city. And that's really very much what we've seen in the Bay Area. But it's worth keeping in mind, as you can see from this, but it's not dominated by people coming. It's just this idea of flux. It's an old way of thinking to imagine that all I want to do is keep everyone who's here and bring more people here. That's not the way it works, okay? Because we can see an example of something I think truly painful. We saw Detroit, where everyone's leaving. We saw Silicon Valley, where it's this incredible flux. Now let's look at a county that's truly troubled and having a lot of problems. This is Randolph County, Elkins County, West Virginia. So what can you tell me about the lines going in and out, telling us what's happening and the sort of dynamism of Elkins County? Nada, right? There's nothing going on. This is a county eating itself. Right? There's really nothing flowing in and out. As a matter of fact, to the extent that there's any migration into and out of this county, young entrepreneurs, anyone looking for anything, it's from adjacent counties or sort of rotation inside the existing county. That's the absence of energy, right? This is, if you think about it in sort of biological terms, this is a cell that's not getting any fuel, right? It's going to cease dividing. There's nothing happening anymore. There's no new source of energy because there's no people coming in. And not surprisingly, that's reflected directly in the economic data. If you look at the economic data for states that have these, counties that have this kind of characteristic, you see exactly the same pattern. So I'd be curious, we haven't done it yet, but we're in the process of collecting some of this sort of flux and human flow data for many regions in Europe. I'd be very curious to see, does it look closer like what we're seeing in West Virginia? Does it look closer to what we're seeing in San Francisco? Does it look closer, or is there a mass exodus? Does it look closer to Detroit? You folks are closer to it than I am, but my hunch initially is the flows don't look anything like what we're seeing on the West Coast example. Maybe they look more like West Virginia, I don't know. Here's an example to show you that it's possible to do it in other places, because the problem I have with using the Bay Area or even Silicon Valley as an example for anything is it's a crazy anomaly. And anyone who tries to duplicate it usually fails for all kinds of reasons. And so it's useful to always think about, is there anywhere else that's created this kind of flow of people and been able to drive some entrepreneurial activity? Well, this is Boulder County. Boulder's been one of the most remarkable success stories regionally in the United States over the last 10 years in terms of its picking up a much more entrepreneurial ethos, one that isn't really predicated on the presence of like a Stanford or a Berkeley or anything else. CU Boulder's a lovely school, but it ain't Stanford. So what's happened there? Well, what's happening there is there's been the emergence of some entrepreneurs, which has attracted other entrepreneurs. It doesn't hurt that Boulder's a lovely place to live. And there's also been the development of sort of a venture capital core with funds like Foundry and others, and the emergence of tech stars. But it's been this constellation of activities, no single thing, but the result shows up dramatically in the flow of people. Because like San Francisco, what do we see? We see this incredible flux of people coming in and out, right? Not dominated by in or out, but lots of both. And it's drawing from around the country, right? It's not just drawing from adjacent counties. It's not just eating up the population of other regions. So this is what's incredibly important, because that's where you get the diversity. That's where you get the collisions. And this is where you get something that I think I see less in Europe, but I've seen more of recently. I historically seen less, is this idea of alienation. One of the things that's worked best in driving entrepreneurship in the United States is this idea of going far enough away from your family to fail, right? I go far enough from my family so I can do something completely idiotic, right? Completely nuts, and I don't have to worry about my mom running into someone in the grocery store and saying, I heard your son's got this crazy company and they're doing this goofy thing. Why didn't he take the job at the bank? Right? You don't have to deal with that stuff, right? Because you're so far away, you're on the other side of the country, or you're in Boulder or somewhere else. That's one, and it's a crazy function, but that's one of the things that works most and is most important in driving entrepreneurship among young people, is sort of alienating yourself, getting away from the people who are most worried about you failing so you don't have to worry about them worrying about you, right? So think about that as you think about what you're doing and how you innovate and how you think about being entrepreneurial here in Europe. So those are some of the people-level disruptive forces, but there's incredibly important economic disruptive forces working it well. And I'll start off at the level of an individual, just as a kind of treated as almost an equity trade. So here's a basket of stocks. I call it the Apple Death Star. So these are all the companies that Apple's killing, right? You can think of all the names, right? I mean, there's RIM, the nearly dearly departed RIM. There's Nokia, which has been, I think, badly damaged. There's Sony. There's Books A Million. There's a whole bunch of these companies that have essentially have a big problem, and that big problem is Apple, right? Because Apple has grown roughly one Procter & Gamble's worth of revenues in 7 years. Think about that. Procter & Gamble's been around for 100 years. Fortune 500 company. In 7 years, on the basis of the launch of a series of products dating forward from the iPod, Apple has grown an entire Procter & Gamble, an entire Fortune 500 worth of revenues. Now, you think, well, that's kind of cool. I wonder how I do that. Think about it more deeply. That revenue has to come from somewhere. Unlike the last bubble, where we had generally revenueless companies getting prodigious market capitalizations, we have companies, new and old, getting giant new revenues. That comes from somewhere. We're not selling phones and iPads and iPods to offshore buyers or off-planet buyers, right? I don't know any off-planet buyers who are buying this stuff. It's coming from other companies. So we're disrupting them. We're blowing up the model of a host of other companies who, for various reasons, aren't moving fast enough or aren't launching innovative new products. So the disruption this time around is happening from the inside. We're actually taking out the guts of many existing companies and saying, you know what you're producing no longer matches what people want to buy, and so they're being blown up to the point that in the last 12 months, if you had just as a lark gone long Apple and gone short all the people Apple was hurting, where would you have made more money? You would have made more money being short everyone Apple was hurting, which is really a statement about how badly damaged all of the incumbents have been by these rapid changes. Are we going to do this in the dark? All the rapid changes that have been going on in the industry. So think about that, okay? One entire Procter & Gamble's worth of revenues, which is, I just think, astounding. It's also happening at the level of incumbent companies. So let's get away from thinking about an Apple. You know, they're an old company. Who knows what they're doing? I mean, you know, it's great that everything's worked out for them, but let's get down to the level of, you know, some of the trendier guys. So this was a map done using LinkedIn data of the flow of people among some of the putatively hot technology companies on the west coast of the United States. And what you see, I think, is really incredible. So the arrows show you where people are coming from and where they're going to, right? So that follow the direction, follow the bouncing baby arrow, and you find out where people are going. So people are going from, you know, Yahoo to LinkedIn, or from Apple to LinkedIn, or wherever. And the number on the line tells you the ratio, right? So for every one person going in one direction, there's however many people going in the other direction. So what's happening here? What's happening is this incredible hollowing out, right? So to a first approximation, the entire Bay Area is being fed by Yahoo, right? It's become like the happy hunting ground for anybody who needs to hire. It's like, yeah, we can find one of those at Yahoo, right? So you've got 10.5 to 1 people leaving Yahoo going to Facebook. We've got 3.5 to 1 to Microsoft, 4.3 to 1 to LinkedIn, but even much bigger numbers in some other funny places. Like, for example, another company on this graph increasingly looks troubled. It looks like they're seeing a kind of hollowing out and sort of an entrepreneurial disruption. And who's that? It's not just Yahoo. I'm sorry? Yeah, Microsoft, right? Look at the numbers, in particular from Microsoft to Facebook. Right. 30 to 1. It's kind of like, well, the last Microsoft employee, turn out the lights, please. These are big numbers, 22 to 1 over to LinkedIn. So these are big numbers, and this shows people voting with their feet and saying, here's where the opportunities are. No different than what we saw at the level of counties, right? Where we saw people leaving counties and moving for opportunity. We're seeing this at the level of companies, even within the Bay Area, where they're being disrupted from the inside. So huge changes underway, so we have to be careful even how we think about who's dominant and why they're dominant and whether they'll continue to be dominant. So a lot of this being driven by this latest round of change, being driven by some truly seismic changes at the level of how we behave, right? Like we're all Twittering and we're all hanging around on social networks and we're consuming video over mobile, and all of that sort of thing is attached to revenues. Attached to revenues at the level of advertising, attached to revenues on the level of device sales, attached to revenues on the level of bandwidth sales for backbone providers, and that's all showing up in these incredible ramps. The growth in mobile users, the growth in cell towers, the data consumption per wireless device is just astonishing. And even at the level, I don't have it here, but even at the level of the consumption of all of this, remember back in the late 1990s, we built out all these fiber optic networks, especially transoceanic cables. Those things were sitting at 5 and 8% of capacity for the longest time. As of this year, according to the latest telegeography data, they're now sitting at 65 and 70% of capacity. So we're actually finally soaking up all the bandwidth on these backbone lines, and that's a remarkable statement about huge change in just a couple of years. But it's not just the industries that are being blown up, and it's not just the whole idea of where you live that's being blown up and creating these entrepreneurial opportunities. It's even the people inside the business that are funding the disruption that are getting blown up. So the VCs, the venture capitalists, and the investors themselves are getting destroyed. We're fond of pointing out at the Kaufman Foundation, we're one of the largest investors in venture capital. We've got, I don't even know anymore, I'll say 30, but it might be 40, different GPs in which we are invested as a limited partner. So we're an investor in venture capital funds who in turn are investors in startups. And so this is a painful statistic for us because we look out and we see that the 5-year and 10-year rolling returns for the venture capital industry have turned negative. In other words, you've pretty much locked in losing money if you're in there for the rate of time that they want you, the length of time they want you to be there. I had a VC recently tell me that this was the wrong statistic to use if you want to evaluate venture capital, that no one should be investing in venture capital for a 5 or a 10-year return. And I thought, oh, how long? How long should we be hanging in then if it's not 5 or 10 years? And he said, well, I mean, generally speaking, we tell people 20, but we prefer 40 to 50. And I said, I totally get that. I said, but were I you, I'd go full hero here, and I'd go for 100 years. And get total plausible deniability so no one can come back to you while you're alive. I don't say, don't screw around with 20 to 40 years. So the bottom line is the results have been horrific in the last 10 years, and for a bunch of different reasons. Here's just one of them. One of them is that the entire venture industry and the investment side of this business is levered entirely to IPOs, right? Initial public offerings. And there's been an incredible slowdown, both in terms of the rate, the number of IPOs produced, and the speed at which they happen, right? Because we would love to see as an investor, I want to invest in you today and have you go public tomorrow. That's my perfect world. How does that sound? Well, it doesn't really happen very often, right? I don't get that. So, okay. I'll settle for, sooner rather than later. Well, sooner has become a lot later when it comes to initial public offerings. In the early 1980s, we were sitting at about 5 years. As of 2007, we're sitting at about almost 10 years. So there's been this remarkable expansion in the amount of time until a company goes public. That plays back to me as an investor because it slows down the speed at which I can get my money back, and that hurts my investors in turn, right? So there's been an incredible slowdown. To be fair, it's sped up a little bit in the last few years. We're seeing some younger companies of size going back out again. We saw LinkedIn earlier this year, right? I think Angie's List went public yesterday. Someone can correct me. Yesterday, and some company whose name starts with G that I refuse to talk about from Chicago went public recently as well. Groupon, these guys. So, why is that all happening to the venture industry? And I'll tie this back to entrepreneurs and the opportunity for folks in this room in a second. Well, you can see it pretty clearly here, I think. What the venture industry tried was a giant experiment with mega funds, right? If a $50 million fund is good, a $100 million fund must be great, and a $1 billion fund must be awesome, right? So that's what they raised. They raised giant funds. And you see this steady accumulation of funds, which peaked around sort of 2000, or at least sort of hit a sort of a plateau around 2000 in terms of committed capital. The total amount of committed capital in the US venture industry hit roughly a plateau that it's sat at ever since 2000. But at the same time, what happened to the 5-year performance, the trailing 5-year performance of the industry? Fell off a cliff, right? Completely collapsed. Now you could say, that's just a coincidence. There are all kinds of other things went wrong, But it starts to kind of hang in there, doesn't it? It's not like it just fell off a cliff briefly and then got better right away. No, what we see is, as long as that committed capital sits up there at those kinds of levels, the 5-year performance of the industry is in the doldrums. So what would we expect rationally to happen? Well, as a rational investor, if you see your assets are doing poorly, you take your money out of that asset. Why has that not happened in venture capital? Why has this industry not shrunk? Why is committed capital not smaller than it is? Well, anyone who's been around venture knows the answer. Venture capitalists have cleverly constructed terms that mean that it takes roughly 10 years to kill a venture capital fund. Very clever, right? Why? Because when you commit money to a venture fund, you commit typically, it ranges, but let's say on average for a 10-year duration. So I could have just invested in your excellent .com only fund in February of 2000, and I'm locked in for 10 years, right? February of 2010. So it takes 10 years to kill a fund. So that's bad news if we were in 2005, but we're not in 2005, right? We're in 2011. So we're at the end of that 10-year horizon, right? If it takes 10 years to kill a fund and we created this problem 10 years ago, what should we be expecting to have happen right now? A rapid contraction, right? Because investors aren't idiots. They look at this and they say, maybe these whole 10 years have just been, bad luck. But maybe it has to do with the size of the industry. And so we think the latter at Kaufman, and so we believe the venture industry in the United States is on a pace to contract by roughly 50% over the next 5 years. If you tell venture capitalists that, which is huge fun, by the way, I encourage you to do that, they all say, absolutely, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be those guys, right? It's great, right? They always point to somebody else. It's not them. We'll be fine. I pity those guys over there, though. It's just must be awful for them. So it's going to sink by 50%. And that might sound like a terrible thing. No, it's a fantastic thing. Here's why. It's a fantastic thing because it means that the industry is going to shrink its way back to health. And why should we care? Because you want a healthy venture industry. You want a healthy seed investing industry. Because as an entrepreneur, you want to know that your venture capitalists or others, should you choose to go that road, are going to be there to support you. You don't want to have it worried that these folks aren't going to be able to raise money, or worse yet, that they'll do a capital call and try and bring in some money for your next round of capital and find out that their LPs don't support them anymore. There's one last problem in the venture industry that's worth mentioning is they're turning into a bunch of old dudes. So this is the Midas list from Forbes of the most successful venture capitalists, sort of on a rolling basis, responsible for most of the historical returns of the industry. And what do they have in common? Old white males, right? Nothing wrong with that, of course. That's a lovely thing. But what you realize is that this is an industry that's increasingly living off returns that happened 15 and 20 years ago. And many of the people most responsible for those returns, who are fantastically smart and creative investors, are rapidly becoming ex-venture investors. You see that in this group. So many of them are active, but some of them have moved on. China, I think, has become a euphemism for retiring. Angel CEOs and others, and the list continues. Even people like Don Valentine of Sequoia and others, these are now folks in their 70s and on. And so we've got a generational problem in the venture industry. So again, another reason why we're seeing this wrenching transformation of the entire entrepreneurship ecosystem from the inside. And this is sort of was a reflection of what the response has been, and this is good for folks in this room, I think, is the rise and fall of seed investing. Right? Seed investing had gone fairly dramatically out of fashion towards the end of the last decade, and then certainly in the early part of this one. But it's really come back in a major way. We're seeing the emergence of seed funds and super seed funds, and Techstars-like networks, which are really just other different ways of kind of instantiating seed investing. But the reassuring thing is that it's still not back at levels that I think are very scary. As a percentage of overall investing, seed is really only back to its historical norms, and that's not such a bad thing. So that seed has come back to its current levels is hugely important because it reflects what we all in this room see, which is that the cost of creating companies has collapsed, right? The sort of thing that cost $4 or $5 million to do in the late 1990s might now cost $40,000 or $50,000, might even be free, depending on what sort of open source frameworks and other software products you need. It's not even limited entirely to IT. We're seeing more and more that the costs of at least a subset of the components of doing things in biotechnology are declining. We're seeing it even in some areas in material with things like 3D printers and other products. So this incredible decline in the cost of company creation is hugely important because we had this terrible mismatch, right? The size of venture capital funds was going straight up, and the cost of company creation was going straight down. How does that make any sense? That's why you get into this perverse conversation sometimes with venture capitalists where they say, I need to raise $500,000, and they say, well, will you take $5 million? It was like, or even worse, they'll say, well, you come back when you need $5 million. Well, no, I need $500,000. Okay, fine. I need $5 million. Well, your business doesn't require $5 million. Why are we having this conversation? Right? And you realize the reason why you're having this perverse conversation is because it's driven by the capital needs of the venture capitalists. When you've got $1 billion under management, you do not want to put money out at $500,000 at a time, right? Because it's like, I'm going to have 10,000 of you crazy entrepreneurs. I want to put money out $5 and maybe even $25 million at a time, because then, I can manage all this stuff and still have time to go to, to Vail on Friday afternoons. And so you don't want to do it at this slow pace. And so whenever we right-size the venture industry and shrink it by half, what's going to happen? The speed at which investors want to put out money is going to match what entrepreneurs need given the declining cost of company creation. And that's fantastic news, I think. So the result is that we're seeing this incredible disruption. Many of the incumbent funds are disappearing or at least becoming less relevant. If you ask around the Bay Area, who would you most like to have your fund? If you ask around the Bay Area, it's always kind of fun. Ask the LPs, the investors, who are the top funds? Who do you really want to put your money in? And they'll say, Kleiner and NEA and all these long-standing venture funds. Then you turn it around and you ask entrepreneurs, who would you most like to get money from? You won't typically hear about Kleiner or NEA. You'll hear about individuals. That's one way the industry's changed. You'll hear about, a Josh Kopelman or a Fred Wilson or a Brad Feld or someone else, individual names of investors. And they're all from funds that aren't in the list of funds that LPs will give you. So this is an industry that's completely changing, and even the investors aren't noticing, which is really remarkable. So I'll kind of wind up by talking directly to sort of the entrepreneurs and thinking about how you kind of frame things for yourself. This is the way I think about it as I'm creating stuff and as I'm investing in companies. For the longest time, you know, one of the most boring, awful presentations you almost inevitably hear at meetings like this is what venture capitalists want. Because like, who really cares, right? What I want to do is I have something I want to solve. I have a problem that I'm interested in as an entrepreneur. I don't believe the VC really knew what they were doing. Maybe they'd be out starting the company, but I have something and you can help me reframe it, but don't tell me what you really want. So I try to sort of think about it in terms of how you should frame the way you think about what you're doing, right? And it's really 3 questions for me, as opposed to, you know, what your investors want or anything else. It's why this? You're always asking yourself this question, you know, why this? Why am I doing this as opposed to something else, right? Why is it this particular thing? Why is this the right lever for this market? Is it the right product, the right service? Why this, right? So there's constant asking yourself about why this. These are like really three why questions for me. So why this? Why you? Right? Because, you know, there's hundreds of people, thousands of people. There's a room full of people right here. We all were raising our hands earlier who've all been thinking entrepreneurially and have ideas for things they want to create. But the question should be, you know, why you in the face of all the people who are likely having the same idea at the same time? Why are you the right person to do this? And that's a question for you to answer for yourself. It can be a question for you to answer for your spouse. It can be a question for you to answer for your investors. But you need to have an answer. Right? It needs to have an answer. And some of the best answers aren't answers that say, well, because, you know, I have a degree at from this prestigious university and so on. I mean, who cares, right? What's important is having an answer, and the answer is one that's really compelling for yourself, for your friends, that gives you motivation late at night, that keeps you doing this whenever it looks like you're not going to be able to, you know, meet cash on a, you know, Monday morning. It's got to be an answer that's compelling on that level, and it's an answer that usually has a narrative. There's usually a story, right? Some kind of story associated with it. I've always been passionate about this because here's what happened to me 10 years ago, and I've been waiting for someone to fix it, and no one would fix it, and I tried this and tried that, and finally I said, you know what, I'm going to have to do this. But some answer that keeps you going in the dark of night when everything tells you you should quit. And then probably last and most important, you know, why now, right? Because it's one of the fundamental problems when you've got a tiny company with limited resources. The question you always have to answer for yourself is, I get that this should happen. I get that I'm the right person to do it. But why should it happen now as opposed to 5 years ago? You'll often get the question, oh, you're too late. You know, it's what the Google guys got, you know, in '99, right? It's too late, search is done. Oh, darn, it's over, right? So why now? Is it too late? 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, 6 months? Is it too late? Versus, are you too early, right? Is it 5 years from now? Because the problem with a small company is you need to kind of match the speed at which your product hits the market with kind of an inflection point in the market, because otherwise you're just hanging around burning money on a bonfire. You got to match up. I got to figure out that I'm going to be able to launch something quickly and hit the market as it's beginning to ramp up. And so you've always got to be answering the question, not just is it too late, but am I so much too early that I'm just going to sit around burning money, which has been the problem in a lot of clean tech and materials, but it even happens in IT a lot too. So why is this the right time versus 5 years ago or 5 years from now? And I think it's one of those questions that if you can articulate an answer to it and bury it in the way you talk to customers, the way you talk to investors, the way you talk to employees, or the way you talk to yourself in the shower, you'll feel much better. So, sort of to wrap up then, let's just, in the back of your mind, if you walk away with anything, walk away with the idea that we're in this sort of wrenching change. It's happened many times historically. It's happening at the level of individuals. It's happening at the level of economies. It's happening at the level of technologies. It's happening at all the fundamental levels that we operate inside. Everyone's feeling it. It's being articulated in different ways, but it's creating huge opportunities for entrepreneurs around the world. I like to think of it like this. Anybody know what this is? Anyone ever? It's like, dude, it's Zork, man. So this is Zork, right? It's one of the great text adventures, probably one of the, you know, I think most sort of seminal important video games of all time. Why was it so great? Well, it was great in its day because it was this unstructured adventure, right? Where you didn't have to like worry about whether or not I would click madly on the screen and nothing would happen. I'm like, man, this video game is awful. No, it was a text adventure, so you just say, you know, like, eat myself. Right? I could say anything. If you see eat, by the way, I'd encourage you to do that inside of Zork. I think it comes back and says something like auto-cannibalization is not the answer, or something like that. So you can do whatever you want inside the game. And it created this open-ended adventure, right? Where there was a goal, there was an objective, but you could pursue it in all kinds of unstructured ways. There wasn't one path to the conclusion, and that's one of the things that made it hugely exciting and rewarding. And I think of entrepreneurship in exactly the same way, right? It's this open-ended, it's probably the greatest open-ended adventure in capitalism, where you can pursue this objective in your own way, at your own speed, the way that you're most passionate about, and there's no one there to stop you. It's your own open-ended adventure. Thanks. I'm Paul.